I put up a simple no parking sign outside my business, and suddenly the entire neighborhood turned against me. Little did they know, towing their cars would unravel a web of lies, hidden threats, and expose the HOA president's darkest secret. Want to know how a parking dispute nearly brought down the whole HOA? Let me tell you. I slammed on my brakes just in time to avoid hitting the silver Lexus parked squarely in my reserved spot. It was 8:07 a.m. on a Monday, and my usual quiet arrival at the office turned into a moment of confusion and then rising frustration. There weren't just one or two strange cars in our private lot. There were three, all unfamiliar, all taking spaces meant for my team. I circled the lot twice, hoping for some explanation, a note on a windshield, anything, but nothing. Every spot was full, and not a single one of them belonged to my employees. Grumbling under my breath, I parked 2 blocks away and fed coins into a parking meter, something I hadn't done in years. As I walked back toward my building, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. Our office isn't downtown or near any popular cafe. There's no reason for random visitors to take up our lot unless someone told them they could. Inside, my office manager Tanya looked up from her computer with a frown. "Jason and Mia are still circling the block," she said, handing me a coffee. "There's nowhere for them to park. Did you see all those Pinecrest HOA stickers?" My stomach dropped. Pinecrest Gardens was the fancy gated neighborhood right next to our business complex. I looked back out the window. Sure enough, every unfamiliar vehicle had a bright green HOA sticker on the windshield. "Why would their residents park here?" I asked aloud, mostly to myself. Tanya shrugged. "No idea. There's a property management sign near the fence line. Maybe we should call them?" It turned out to be Evergreen Property Management. The receptionist transferred me to a man named Doug, who seemed far too casual when I explained the situation. "Oh yeah, that's probably Pinecrest Gardens," Doug said cheerfully. "Their visitor parking is being repaved this week. The HOA told us they made arrangements to use the lot next door." My pulse quickened. What arrangement? No one asked me. I'm the business owner. Doug hesitated. "Oh, Margaret Wilson, the HOA president, said she had an ongoing understanding with the property owner." "There's no such understanding," I snapped, "and I'd really like this resolved." "Of course," he replied. "I'll look into it." I hung up and stared out at the lot again. My parking lot, my business, and now my employees were paying for meters or parking blocks away. I didn't know it yet, but this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was the first crack in a much deeper issue. A web of lies, hidden influence, and one woman's grip on a neighborhood. And all of it started with a few cars parked in the wrong lot. By the time 3:25 p.m. rolled around, I was sitting in the Pinecrest Gardens Community Clubhouse, flipping through a folder of property documents, parking regulations, and printed emails. I had come prepared. The past 24 hours had turned my workplace into a logistical nightmare. My employees were fed up. Clients were canceling appointments, and all because someone decided my private lot could double as their overflow. The door creaked open. In walked Margaret Wilson, the HOA president, dressed in a designer blazer with a polished smile that didn't reach her eyes. She extended her hand, cold, professional. "Thanks for coming. I understand there's been some confusion." I didn't return the smile. "There's no confusion. Your residents are parking on private property without permission. It's affecting my business." She sat down, carefully crossing her legs. "We're going through a temporary repaving of our visitor lot. It's only for a few weeks. The previous building owner used to let us borrow the space when needed. We're just continuing that arrangement." I stared at her. I bought that building 2 years ago. No one mentioned any agreement during the sale, and I've found no documentation suggesting one exists. Margaret gave a graceful shrug. "Perhaps it was a verbal agreement, a gentleman's understanding." My frustration boiled. "Then let's see it in writing. You can't just assume the rights to someone else's property based on a handshake from a former owner who's now retired in Florida." She leaned forward, her tone patronizing. "We're neighbors. Communities thrive on cooperation. I'm asking for a little patience. Surely you can spare a few parking spaces for a few weeks. This isn't about being neighborly, I said through gritted teeth. This is about boundaries. You didn't ask. You told your residents they could park there. That's trespassing. The shift in her tone was subtle but sharp. You don't need to escalate this. Making waves won't reflect well, especially not for a business relying on local support. Was that a threat? I straightened my back. What won't reflect well is a business losing clients because of an entitled HOA president who thinks she's above the law. Margaret's face stiffened. Let's not be dramatic. Let's be honest, I snapped. You crossed a line, and now you're trying to rewrite history to make it seem like I'm the unreasonable one. She stood, smoothing her blouse. If you're not willing to compromise, I'm afraid this conversation is over. Fine, I said, rising to meet her stare. But the next time we speak, it'll be through legal documentation. As I left the clubhouse, her final words echoed behind me like a warning. You're making this much harder than it needs to be. I clenched my jaw, walking back to my car. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of being stonewalled. She wasn't backing down, but neither was I. This wasn't a negotiation, this was war. I sat alone in my office after hours, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead barely masking the frustration boiling in my chest. That meeting with Margaret had left a bitter taste in my mouth. She had spoken with the polished smugness of someone used to getting her way, hiding behind vague, previous agreements and playing the neighborly card like it was a shield against responsibility. But something didn't sit right. The more I thought about it, the more her story unraveled in my head. So I picked up my phone and made a call to the county records office. The clerk, a woman named Diane, was kind but firm. If there was any formal easement or agreement about parking, it would be recorded in the deed or listed in a supplemental agreement. She paused. Want me to help you look? Yes, I said, almost too quickly. Please, the property is under B Home Design LLC. After 30 minutes of digging through digital files and printed scans, Diane confirmed what I'd suspected. There was no official parking agreement, easement, or shared use clause between my building and Pinecrest Gardens. Not now, not ever. My next call was to Mr. Sanderson, the previous owner of my office building. I tracked him down in Florida, where he was enjoying retirement. When I explained the situation, he laughed, a dry, knowing chuckle. Margaret tried the same stunt with me years ago, he said. Claimed they needed a few spaces for a community picnic and wanted me to sign something informal. I told her no. We never had an agreement, not even verbal. I made sure the title stayed clean. That was the confirmation I needed. I hung up and sat in silence for a moment, letting it all sink in. Margaret had lied, boldly, repeatedly, not just to me but to her entire HOA. She had fabricated an agreement to justify a land grab, banking on the assumption that no one would dig deeper. But I had. And now I had the truth. That night, I drafted an email. Short, precise, backed by facts. Dear Margaret and Pinecrest Gardens Board, I have verified through county records and direct contact with the previous property owner that no parking agreement exists between our properties. Any claim to the contrary is false. Beginning Wednesday morning, any unauthorized vehicle in our lot will be towed at the owner's expense. Proper signage will be posted in accordance with city ordinance. Please inform your residents immediately to prevent unnecessary conflict. Regards, Michael B. Home Design. I CC'd the property management company, the HOA board, and, just for good measure, my attorney. 15 minutes later, Margaret replied, You're making a serious mistake. We'll be pursuing legal options. But her tone was different, less arrogant, less composed, because she knew I'd called her bluff. This was no longer a petty parking dispute. It was a reckoning. That night, I ordered custom private property, towing enforced signs, with legal citations, towing company info, and reflective coating. I scheduled the towing company to install them at every entrance by the next evening. I wasn't being petty. I was protecting my business, my team, and my rights. This wasn't about 5 parking spots anymore. It was about drawing a line and finally standing on the right side of it. Margaret had pushed too far. Now I was pushing back. And for the first time, I had the law, the records, and the truth on my side. It began just after sunrise. I stood across the street from my building, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup, eyes locked on my private lot. The red and white towing signs gleamed in the early morning light. Everything had been installed legally. 24 hours notice, proper language, tow company info. Still, my heart raced. By 7 o'clock a.m., the first car arrived. A sleek black SUV, Pinecrest Garden sticker in the rear window. The driver, a woman in business attire, barely glanced at the new signage before pulling into my reserved spot. Then came another, and another. By 8 o'clock a.m., 12 cars had filled the lot. I texted the towing company, "Go now." At 9 o'clock a.m., sharp, the tow trucks rolled in like clockwork, 3 of them rumbling down the street with steel determination. What followed was mechanical ballet, hooks, lifts, hydraulic arms locking onto axles. One by one, the unauthorized vehicles were loaded onto flatbeds, and then the chaos began. A man in scrubs came sprinting down the sidewalk, waving his arms. "Wait! That's my car! I have a shift starting in 10 minutes!" Too late. The truck carrying his car was already halfway down the block. Then a woman in a pink robe, curlers still in her hair, stormed across the lot. "Who the hell gave you permission to tow my vehicle?" "I did," I said, stepping forward, voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. "This is private property. The signs have been up since yesterday. Your HOA was informed." That set off the crowd. "Margaret said it was okay to park here." "This is harassment. I have medical equipment in my trunk." Accusations flew like sparks, igniting the air with tension. Phones were out, people were filming. The scene looked like a suburban riot brewing in a corporate parking lot. I kept calm, repeating the facts. Private lot, no agreement, legal signage, HOA lied. Then, right on cue, Margaret Wilson herself appeared. Her luxury SUV screeched into the lot, horn blaring. She jumped out in full battle mode, pressed pantsuit, manicured nails, fury in her eyes. "You have crossed a line," she hissed, marching toward me. "You're disrupting lives, embarrassing people. This is unacceptable." "No," I replied coolly. "What's unacceptable is misleading an entire neighborhood to cover your own lack of planning." She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You'll regret this. I sit on the city planning commission, remember? I can make things very uncomfortable for your little design firm." Behind her, people gasped. Someone was still recording. "You're threatening me again?" I asked, projecting my voice so the phones would catch every word. "In front of witnesses?" She froze. A man stepped forward, gray-haired, in a rumpled bathrobe. "Margaret, you told us there was a deal. You promised." More residents followed. "She lied to us." "Why didn't we know there was no agreement?" "I got towed because of your mistake." Margaret spun in place, surrounded by the very people she claimed to represent. Her carefully crafted facade crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. She tried to deflect, to redirect the blame, but no one was buying it anymore. The tide had turned. One by one, residents left the lot, some fuming, others shaken, a few apologetic. My lot stood quiet again, cleared for employees and clients. I looked around at the aftermath, the tension, the confrontation, the small crowd still whispering in disbelief. Something had changed. This wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about trust. And Margaret had just lost hers. The next battle wasn't far behind. But in that moment, standing on solid legal ground, I knew one thing for sure. They came for my parking lot. Now I had their attention. The air in the HOA community center crackled with unease. The room, usually half empty for monthly meetings, was now packed wall to wall with residents, some still dressed in business attire, others with arms crossed in silent outrage. The fallout from the mass towing was still fresh. People had questions, and every one of them had Margaret Wilson in their sights. She sat at the head table, flanked by the remaining board members, posture rigid, jaw clenched. Her trademark smile was nowhere to be seen. For the first time since this whole mess began, she looked rattled. Robert Thompson, the HOA's vice president, called the meeting to order. "We're here to address the events of the past week," he said, his voice steady but tight. "Specifically the mass towing incident, the alleged parking agreement, and the integrity of our board communications." Murmurs swept the room like dry grass catching fire. Margaret cleared her throat. "If I may—" "Not yet," Robert cut her off, flipping open a folder. "First, we need to establish a few facts. Mr. Carter, please step forward." I rose from my seat near the back and walked to the microphone. My hands didn't shake this time. I had the truth and proof. I spoke clearly. "I own the commercial property adjacent to Pinecrest Gardens. My business has suffered greatly due to unauthorized parking by HOA residents. Despite repeated warnings, the problem escalated until towing became necessary." Margaret smirked, as if she were waiting for her cue to discredit me. But I wasn't finished. I tapped the laptop beside me, and the screen lit up with a scanned document. "This is an email from the previous property owner, Mr. Sanderson. In it, he states that no formal or informal parking agreement was ever made with Pinecrest Gardens." Gasps filled the room. I clicked to the next slide. A signed letter from my lawyer confirming that no easement, arrangement, or verbal agreement existed in public records. Margaret leaned toward her mic, voice sharp. "That letter proves nothing. Mr. Sanderson may not have remembered—" "Then explain this," Robert interrupted, holding up another document. "A copy of a proposal your board submitted 15 years ago asking for temporary overflow parking access, which Mr. Sanderson explicitly rejected in writing." A collective gasp swept the room again. The tension was tangible. "And finally," I added, "a recording of a phone call from Margaret Wilson to me, threatening to use her position on the City Planning Commission to make things very uncomfortable for my business." I pressed play. The room fell dead silent as Margaret's voice echoed through the speakers. "You don't want to make an enemy of me. I sit on the City Planning Commission. One word from me, and your next permit application will vanish." The recording ended. The silence hung heavy for a moment, then exploded into whispers, gasps, and outrage. Margaret turned pale. "You took advantage of all of us?" a woman called from the back. "You lied!" another voice shouted. "You told us this was pre-approved!" Robert stood again. "Margaret, you told the board this parking arrangement had been documented. You said you had records. We've seen nothing." Margaret stammered. I didn't think it would matter. It was just for a few weeks." "You lied to the entire neighborhood," someone snapped, "and now we're paying the price." An elderly man, Robert Jenkins, the longest-standing homeowner, rose slowly. His voice was firm, but calm. "I've lived here since the first houses were built. Never have I seen such arrogance. It's time for a change." Applause broke out, growing louder by the second. Margaret sat frozen, her power unraveling right before her eyes. The facade was gone. The community had seen her for who she really was, and there was no going back. She started this war with lies, but truth just delivered the final blow. The gavel struck the podium with a sharp crack. "All in favor of removing Margaret Wilson from her position as HOA president, please raise your hand," Robert Thompson announced, his voice steady, yet brimming with quiet authority. Hands shot up across the room. Dozens of them. Even some of Margaret's longtime allies hesitated only briefly before lifting their arms. The weight of the week's events had settled on everyone, and the truth had finally pierced through the fear, the manipulation, and the uncertainty. When the vote was counted, 6-1 from the board and an overwhelming majority from attending residents, the silence was deafening. Margaret sat frozen. Her hands, once used to signing off fines and letters with confident flourish, now trembled slightly in her lap. The same mouth that had hurled accusations and thinly veiled threats remained tightly shut, lips pressed into a thin, white line. Robert cleared his throat. "The motion passes. Effective immediately, Margaret Wilson is removed as president of Pinecrest Gardens Homeowners Association. An ethics investigation into her conduct will proceed." A wave of relief washed over the room like a long-awaited breeze on a stifling day. Whispers turned to scattered applause, then a rising chorus of claps, cheers, and even laughter. Neighbors who'd never exchanged more than a nod began embracing. Others simply stood, stunned, as if waking from a long neighborhood-wide nightmare. I sat back in my chair, the tension in my shoulders finally starting to release. Tanya, my office manager, who'd come to support me, patted my shoulder with a small smile. "You did it," she whispered. But I knew we had done it. Robert looked out at the crowd, then back at me. "On behalf of the board," he said, "we owe you an apology, Mr. Carter, not only for the parking ordeal, but for allowing it to escalate this far." I nodded in appreciation, still trying to process it all. Margaret gathered her papers slowly, deliberately, and stood. As she turned to leave, all eyes were on her. Not with fear, not even with anger anymore, but with the quiet dignity of people who had taken their power back. Once the doors shut behind her, a new kind of energy filled the room. Residents began raising their hands, not to complain, but to suggest. Ideas flew about new communication boards, quarterly town halls, even forming a small business alliance for those of us near the commercial strip. Someone joked about painting over Margaret's parking privilege map with something more accurate, respect and mutual consent. By the end of the night, it wasn't just a meeting, it was the beginning of a new chapter. For the first time in a long time, we weren't just neighbors, we were a community, and we'd just proven what could happen when good people stop staying silent and start standing together. In the weeks following Margaret's removal, a quiet but powerful transformation swept through the neighborhood. The once tense atmosphere that had hovered like a storm cloud began to lift. Conversations started happening on front porches again. Neighbors waved without hesitation. The lot that had sparked so much division now stood as a symbol of something greater, the victory of fairness over favoritism and of integrity over intimidation. For me, the most powerful realization was this: sometimes doing what's right means standing alone first, until others find the courage to stand beside you. And while the road may feel uncertain, especially when you're challenging someone in a position of authority, the truth has a way of working its way to the surface. Just like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, justice, when pursued with patience and evidence, can restore balance even in the most unjust situations. What began as a frustrating parking dispute revealed something far more important: the need for accountability in leadership and transparency in how communities are managed. Margaret had ruled through fear and manipulation, using her position to serve her own agenda. But when her influence crumbled, what was left behind wasn't chaos, it was opportunity. The HOA, now under new leadership, began drafting reforms that encouraged open discussion, documented decisions, and gave residents a real voice in how their neighborhood was run. Even more heartening was how the surrounding business community rallied together. We formed a small alliance promising to share legal resources, local contacts, and, most importantly, support when one of us faced unfair treatment. That network still exists today, and it all started with the simple act of saying, "This isn't right." For older adults especially, many of whom have faced their fair share of unfair systems and strong-willed personalities, this story offers a timeless reminder. You're never too old to speak up, never too late to push back, and never too small to make a difference. It also reminds us that quiet resilience is not weakness, it's strength in its most composed form. There's also a deeper truth here about legacy. Margaret's actions created division, but the aftermath allowed something better to take root: a culture of shared responsibility, respect, and integrity. And that's the kind of neighborhood and world we should all want to leave behind for the next generation. As I watch new residents move in, unaware of the drama that once unfolded here, I find myself hopeful. Not because conflict disappeared, but because people learned how to handle it. With grace, with facts, with courage. And if there's one lesson I'll carry forward, it's this: when we plant seeds of respect, truth, and unity, even during storms, what we harvest is always worth the effort.